the roar of 1,000 engines over a continent, the distant thrum that spoke of impending doom or fleeting hope. This was the soundscape of Europe in 1944. But for Major General Günther Röhl, a man who had mastered these skies since 1940, who had carved his legend into the very air with 275 confirmed victories, April 24, 1944, wasn't just another day of combat. It was the moment his universe, his ironclad understanding of aerial warfare, began to unravel at 24,000 feet above Brandenburg. Imagine being Röhl. The oxygen mask fogs with each strained breath, the cold metal of his Messerschmitt Bf 109G6 pressing into his back. His eyes, trained for years to spot the minutest glint in the sky, are fixated on an American fighter. It's an impossible sight. He's in a diving turn, pushing his aircraft to its limits, a maneuver designed to shake off any pursuer. Yet the American fighter is still there. It clings to him, a metallic shadow, defying gravity and logic. His earphones, usually a lifeline of calm, professional communication, now crackle with the frantic, disbelieving cries of his most seasoned pilots. These are the veterans of Jagdgeschwader 11, men who had dictated the terms of engagement across Europe for years, now sounding like wide-eyed rookies. "Indian at 6 o'clock high," one shouts, the term Indian, a code for an unknown aggressive American fighter. Another screams, "He's still with me at 400 kilometers per hour. How is he still with me? For 3 long years, Röhl and every Luftwaffe pilot had lived by an inviolable truth, a fundamental law of the skies that had ensured their survival. American fighters lacked the range, the altitude performance, and the speed at height to follow German fighters deep into Reich airspace. They would escort their bombers to a certain point, then inevitably turn back, leaving the lumbering giants vulnerable to the waiting German interceptors. This was the gospel, the strategic bedrock of their air defense. But the aircraft boring down on his wingman, a sleek, silver fighter unlike any he'd seen, was shredding that gospel to pieces. It was a P-51B Mustang, and its Packard-built Merlin engine sang a death song at an altitude where American Thunderbolts and Lightnings had previously gasped for air, struggling for every foot. Röhl's own fuel gauge showed a mere 15 minutes remaining until Brandenburg. Yet, this Mustang, hundreds of miles from its base in England, still had fuel for another hour of combat and the long journey home. The mathematics of air superiority, the delicate balance of distance, altitude, and endurance, had been violently reversed in a single morning. The hunters had become the hunted, not over enemy territory, but over their own capital. The impossible had just happened. What Major Röhl witnessed that fateful April morning wasn't merely the debut of a new American fighter. It was the genesis of the Luftwaffe's systematic destruction. Within a single year, the air force that had terrorized Europe, that had been the spearhead of the Blitzkrieg, would lose an unimaginable 75% of its pilots. More tragically, 90% of its experienced leaders, the men who carried the institutional knowledge and tactical prowess, would vanish from the skies. Germany would cede complete air superiority, forever altering the course of the war. This instrument of destruction, the P-51 Mustang, was an aircraft designed in just 102 days, powered by a British engine, built in quantities that defied German comprehension, and flown by pilots who seemed to multiply faster than they could be shot down. It wasn't just a plane. It was a symbol of an unstoppable industrial and human machine. To truly grasp the seismic shift embodied by the P-51, we must rewind to the precarious position of the U.S. 8th Air Force in mid-1943. The crisis had been building since August 17, 1943, a date etched in infamy as Black Day for American air crews. On that day, the U.S. 8th Air Force launched its deepest penetration raid yet, targeting the critical ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt fighter plant at Regensburg. The mission was a tactical disaster, a bloodbath. The 8th Air Force lost 60 B-17 flying fortresses in a single day. The sky was thick with flak and German fighters, and the unescorted bombers were simply annihilated. The grim mathematics of the strategic bombing campaign had reached a critical inflection point. American bombers were suffering devastating 20% to 25% losses on these deep penetration raids, a rate utterly unsustainable in the long term. This wasn't merely about losing expensive aircraft, it was about the irreplaceable human cost. Each B-17 carried a crew of 10 highly trained specialists, pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, each requiring months of intensive preparation. These losses weren't just a drain on resources, they were a profound blow to morale and a catastrophic hemorrhaging of vital manpower. From his headquarters in Berlin, General Major Adolf Galland, the General der Jagdflieger, the General of Fighters, reviewed the numbers with a profound sense of satisfaction. The Americans were losing bombers at a rate far exceeding their capacity to train replacement crews. The exchange rate, from the German perspective, was decisively in their favor. 1 German fighter pilot for 10 invaluable American bomber crew members. This was a war of attrition, and Germany, it seemed, was winning. Galland, a tactical genius and a fighter ace himself, articulated his strategy to his staff in September 1943 with chilling clarity. The Americans must turn back at the Rhine, he declared, referring to the natural geographical boundary beyond which American escort fighters, primarily the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning, simply lacked the operational range to protect their bomber formations. We can therefore concentrate our forces, wait for the escorts to turn back, and then massacre the bombers at our leisure. And the strategy was working. On October 14, 1943, a day that would forever be known as Black Thursday, the 8th Air Force mounted another ambitious raid on Schweinfurt. The results were even more horrific than the August mission. Another 60 bombers were shot down, and 650 highly trained airmen were lost. The American bombing campaign ground to a halt for 4 agonizing months. No major raids dared penetrate deep into Germany. The Luftwaffe had, through the simple expedient of geography and tactical patience, seemingly won the battle for air superiority. German pilots celebrated, convinced they had broken the back of the American daylight bombing offensive. They believed their skies were safe, their strategy vindicated. Unknown to these celebrating German pilots, however, an extraordinary convergence of engineering genius and industrial might was already underway, stealthily reversing their hard-won victory. The North American P-51 Mustang, the aircraft that would soon shatter their world, had been conceived under rather desperate circumstances. Its genesis wasn't an ambitious American project, but a pragmatic British requirement. In April 1940, with Britain teetering on the brink, facing the full might of the Luftwaffe during the Battle of Britain, they desperately needed more fighters. They approached North American aviation, initially seeking a license to build Curtiss P-40 Warhawks. North American's president, James H. Kindleberger, famously replied, "We can build you a better plane." And they did. In a staggering feat of engineering, the Mustang was designed in a mere 102 days. The prototype, a marvel of rapid development, first flew just 149 days after the contract was signed, a development speed that would have been unthinkable in any other nation, particularly one geared for the slower, more methodical pace of wartime engineering. Initially, the early Mustangs were powered by the Allison V1710 engine. While a capable engine, it proved disappointing above 15,000 feet, precisely the altitude where bomber escort was most critically needed. Pilots found its performance lacking at higher altitudes, rendering it unsuitable for the strategic escort role. For a time, the Mustang was relegated to ground attack and reconnaissance missions, its true potential untapped. But then came the spark of genius, a moment that would redefine aerial warfare. In April 1942, at the Rolls-Royce test facility in Hucknall, England, test pilot Ronald Harker suggested fitting the Mustang with the legendary British Merlin engine. The Merlin, known for its superb high-altitude performance, especially when paired with a two-speed, two-stage supercharger, was a game-changer. This audacious marriage of American aerodynamics, the Mustang's sleek, low-drag airframe, and British power, would produce arguably the war's most decisive fighter aircraft. The challenge was then to mass-produce this British marvel in America. The Packard Motor Car Company in Detroit stepped up to the plate, beginning licensed production of the Merlin engine in August 1941. This wasn't merely about copying. It was about applying American mass production techniques to British precision engineering. The scale was unprecedented. By late 1943, Packard was churning out hundreds of Merlin engines monthly, each one delivering approximately 1,150 horsepower at altitude, precisely where German pilots had felt safest and where their own engines often began to struggle. This industrial might was a silent, potent force, building up behind the scenes, far from the battlefields. The strategic implications of this new aircraft were not lost on astute observers. Colonel Thomas Hitchcock, the American military attaché in London and a former World War I pilot, penned a prophetic report in July 1942. His words, delivered months before the Merlin-powered Mustang even saw combat, were eerily accurate. The P-51 with the Merlin engine will be superior to any existing fighter in the world above 25,000 feet. It will have the range to escort bombers to Berlin and back. This single aircraft could change the entire strategic situation in Europe. Hitchcock understood that individual dogfight performance, while important, was secondary to the overarching strategic goal of protecting bombers and destroying the enemy's industrial capacity. He saw the big picture, the systemic shift this aircraft represented. The German pilots, basking in their perceived victory after Black Thursday, were about to learn just how prophetic Hitchcock's words truly were. December 1st, 1943, marked the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe's complacency. A formation of Focke-Wulf W-190s from Jagdgeschwader II approached American bombers near Solingen, deep inside German territory. The German pilots, hardened veterans with thousands of combined victories, were confident. They had seen the P-47 Thunderbolts, the American escorts, wagging their wings in a familiar farewell gesture to the bombers, signaling their imminent return to base, their fuel exhausted. "Escort dropping away," reported a staff leader, watching the Thunderbolts peel off. "Beginning attack approach." The Germans rolled into their attack dive, executing a well-rehearsed pattern they had perfected over 18 months of unchallenged slaughter. But then, Urgent voices, laced with confusion and alarm, crackled through their radios. Indians! Indians still with the bombers. New type, maintaining escort. 8 P-51B Mustangs of the 354th Fighter Group, the Pioneer Mustang Group, had remained with the bombers. Their secret weapon, external drop tanks, disposable fuel tanks that extended their range by an additional 150 miles, enough to stretch escort coverage deep into Germany. The psychological impact on the German pilots, conditioned by years of uncontested attacks on unescorted bombers beyond the Rhine, was profound. They were utterly unprepared for fighter opposition at this distance, over their own territory. Their carefully crafted tactics, their mental model of air combat, were suddenly obsolete. This wasn't just a new plane. It was a new war. December 13, 1943, brought an even more comprehensive shock. The first major raid with substantial P-51 escort penetrated all the way to Kiel, a critical port city 420 miles from the nearest Allied base. 16 P-51Bs of the 354th Fighter Group not only escorted the bombers flawlessly, but engaged in aggressive fighter sweeps, actively hunting German fighters rather than merely waiting to be attacked. This was a fundamental shift in doctrine, a transition from defensive escort to offensive air superiority. Major Georg Peter Ader, commanding JG-1, a veteran with 78 victories, encountered the Mustangs near Bremen. Ader was a tactical expert, having developed specific tactics for each Allied fighter type. The P-47 could be outmaneuvered at altitude. The Spitfire lacked range. The P-38 Lightning couldn't turn effectively with German fighters. But the P-51 defied categorization. It seemed to have no obvious weaknesses. Ader's report to Jagdkorps headquarters captured the essence of the new threat. First contact at 7,500 meters altitude. Enemy fighters maintained speed and maneuverability superior to our Bf-109G at this height. Pursued my Staffel for 30 kilometers before fuel considerations forced us to land. Enemy continued escort mission without apparent fuel concerns. This was a nightmare scenario. A fighter that was faster and more maneuverable at altitude, with seemingly limitless range. The tables had turned. The personal toll was equally devastating. Oberfeldwebel Heinz Koka, a 33-victory ace with JG-11, penned a stark entry in his diary on December 20th. The appearance of American fighters over Hanover has shaken everyone. We used to take off leisurely when bombers approached, knowing we had time to gain altitude and position. Now we must climb immediately, or risk being bounced by escorts. The war has come to our doorstep. Koka's words vividly illustrate the psychological shift. The leisurely confidence was gone, replaced by a desperate, immediate scramble for survival. The home front was no longer safe. When German intelligence finally obtained accurate performance data for the P-51B in January 1944, the numbers caused disbelief at the highest levels of the Luftwaffe. These weren't just marginal improvements, they represented a paradigm shift. Speed. 440 psi out at 30,000 feet, faster than any German fighter at altitude. This meant German interceptors couldn't easily disengage or dictate the terms of engagement. Range. An astonishing 280 miles with drop tanks, double that of any German fighter. This was the most critical factor, extending the fight deep into the Reich. Ceiling. 42,000 feet service ceiling, higher than the comfortable operating altitude for most German pilots and aircraft. This gave Mustangs a crucial energy advantage. climb. 3,475 feet per minute, superior to the Bf-109G above 20,000 feet, allowing them to dictate vertical engagements. Armament. 6. 50 caliber machine guns with 1 to 880 rounds, enough for extended combat. While not the heavier cannon of German fighters, the sheer volume of fire was devastating. The technological secret behind much of the Mustang's unprecedented efficiency lay in its laminar flow wing. This revolutionary design maintained a smooth airflow over up to 60% of its chord, drastically reducing drag by 30% compared to conventional wing designs. This single innovation was a stroke of genius that provided the P-51 with its exceptional speed and, crucially, the extended range that made long-range escort possible. It allowed the Mustang to conserve fuel more efficiently than any other fighter of its time, turning what would otherwise be a disadvantage into its greatest strength. The cumulative effect of the Mustang's arrival culminated in what became known as Big Week, from February 20th to 25th, 1944. This was not just a series of raids. It was a concerted, coordinated assault designed to deliver the full, overwhelming weight of American air power against German aircraft production facilities across the Reich. Over 1,000 bombers, escorted by 900 fighters, including 150 P-51Bs, darkened the skies. For the first time, American fighters weren't merely escorting, they were actively hunting. They were unleashed, given permission to leave the bomber formations after engaging German interceptors and pursue them back to their airfields, engaging in aggressive sweeps. The results were catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. They lost 355 fighters during Big Week. But the statistics only tell part of the story. More critically, approximately 100 experienced pilots were killed, including dozens of invaluable Staffelkapitän and Gruppenkommandos, squadron and group commanders. These men represented irreplaceable tactical knowledge, leadership, and combat experience. Their loss would have a cascading effect throughout the fighter force, leaving an increasingly inexperienced pool of pilots without mentorship, without the vital guidance needed to survive in the brutal aerial environment. March 4th, 1944, marked a devastating watershed moment. For the first time, American bombing raids penetrated all the way to Berlin itself, with fighter escort. 660 B-17s and B-24s, escorted by a veritable armada of P-51 Mustangs, P-38 Lightnings, and P-47 Thunderbolts, darkened the sky over the Reich capital. The strategic implications were immense. This wasn't just another target. This was Berlin, the heart of Nazi Germany, a city Hitler had promised would never be touched. Adolf Galland, the general of fighters, a man of immense personal courage, flew against this raid himself, leading a scratch force of Bf-109Gs. His after-action report to Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, was brutally honest, stripped of all pretense and propaganda. "We were outnumbered 3-1 by escort fighters," he wrote, the desperation clear in his words. The Mustangs had altitude advantage, speed advantage, and tactical advantage. We managed to damage 3 bombers before being scattered. Then came the ultimate humiliation for a top ace. I personally was chased for 50 kilometers by 2 Mustangs who had fuel to toy with me like cats with a mouse. The appearance of American fighters, specifically the Mustangs, over Berlin shattered the last vestiges of German air superiority, not just militarily, but psychologically. Civilians who had been constantly fed propaganda that the Luftwaffe was winning, that German skies were inviolable, now watched in stunned silence as silver Mustangs flew victory loops over the Brandenburg Gate. The regime's credibility, already strained by military defeats on multiple fronts, crumbled further. The sight of enemy fighters dominating the skies above their capital was a potent, visible symbol of impending defeat. By April 1944, P-51 pilots had developed an even more devastating tactic, pushing the boundaries of offensive air power. After completing their escort duties, instead of simply returning to base, they would descend to treetop level and embark on aggressive fighter sweeps, strafing targets of opportunity on their return flight. German airfields, once considered safe havens, once Allied bomber formations had passed overhead, suddenly became lethal killing grounds. April 13, 1944, perfectly exemplified this brutal new reality. After escorting bombers to Schweinfurt, 42 Mustangs from the renowned 4th Fighter Group descended like avenging angels on German airfields across Bavaria. In just 30 minutes of concentrated strafing, they destroyed an incredible 51 aircraft on the ground, damaged 23 more, killed dozens of essential ground personnel, and annihilated irreplaceable maintenance facilities. This wasn't just about destroying planes. It was about destroying the infrastructure that supported air operations, choking the Luftwaffe's ability to even get aircraft into the air. By May 1944, the Luftwaffe faced a catastrophic pilot shortage, a wound that bled profusely and fatally. Monthly losses exceeded 25% of their operational strength, a rate that no fighting force, no matter how dedicated, could sustain. Simultaneously, their training programs, desperate to churn out replacements, produced increasingly inferior pilots. The contrast with the Allies was stark and utterly devastating. The average German fighter pilot in 1944 received a mere 110 to 160 flight hours before being thrown into the inferno of combat. This paled in comparison to the approximately 400 hours American pilots received, or even the 220 to 250 hours German pilots themselves had received in 1941 during their heyday. By early 1945, some German pilots were entering combat with as little as 80 hours total flight time, barely enough to safely handle their aircraft, let alone engage in complex aerial combat. Obergruppenführer Johannes Mackie Steinhoff, commanding Jagdgeschwader 77, documented this horrific crisis with an almost unbearable poignancy. We received children as replacements. Boys of 19 with minimal training who have never flown above 5,000 meters, never fired at a moving target, never experienced combat maneuvers. We must send them against American pilots with 400 hours of training, many with previous combat experience. The quality differential wasn't just a factor. It became a force multiplier for American effectiveness, a devastating asymmetry in skill and experience. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group, who would eventually score 21 aerial victories, observed this grim reality firsthand. By spring 44, half the German pilots we encountered were easy kills. They'd fly predictable patterns, failed to use clouds for cover, and panic when bounced. The old hands were still dangerous. You could tell immediately by how they flew, but they were increasingly rare. This wasn't bravado. It was a brutal assessment of the qualitative collapse of the German fighter arm. The elite warrior corps was being replaced by cannon fodder. The strategic bombing campaign against German oil facilities, intensified dramatically in May 1944, created an additional, interconnected crisis that magnified the P-51's advantages exponentially. German aviation fuel production plummeted from 180,000 tons in April to a paltry 20,000 tons by September. This wasn't just a logistical hiccup, it was a death knell. Training flights, already curtailed, were almost entirely eliminated. Combat operations were severely restricted, reserved only for the most decisive engagements. German aircraft, even if available, were often grounded due to a lack of fuel. Meanwhile, American pilots, fueled by an almost limitless supply, were flying training missions over Germany itself. P-51 groups would conduct fighter sweeps, offensive patrols specifically designed to find and destroy German aircraft. With virtually unlimited fuel, American pilots could loiter over German airfields, waiting patiently for defenders to take off, then attack them at their most vulnerable moment. During takeoff or landing, when their speed was low, their maneuverability limited, and their focus divided. This was a psychological masterstroke, turning the enemy's home ground into a training arena and a hunting ground simultaneously. The introduction of the Messerschmitt Mu 262 jet fighter in the summer of 1944 briefly ignited a desperate flicker of hope within the beleaguered Luftwaffe. With a top speed of 540 mph, the Ma 262 was a staggering 100 mph faster than even the P-51D, the latest Mustang variant. Hitler, ever prone to believing in wonder weapons, saw it as the ultimate technological savior, a weapon that would single-handedly reverse the trajectory of the air war. But the P-51 pilots, demonstrating remarkable tactical adaptability, quickly developed effective counters to the jets. They understood the Mi-262's vulnerabilities. While untouchable at high speed, the jets were slow and cumbersome during takeoff and landing. So, Mustang pilots would loiter near Mi-262 airfields, patiently waiting for the moment of maximum vulnerability. Their superior range meant they could afford to wait, conducting long, patient patrols. The Mi-262's technological superiority, immense as it was tragically nullified by harsh operational realities. The jets required high-grade synthetic fuel, which was becoming increasingly scarce due to the Allied oil campaign. Their revolutionary but temperamental engines needed replacement every 10 to 25 hours of flight time, an impossibility given Germany's disrupted supply chains and dwindling industrial capacity. Most critically, these sophisticated aircraft demanded highly experienced pilots for effective operation. Yet the Luftwaffe had tragically few veterans remaining. While notable Mi-262 pilots like Franz Schall, credited with shooting down 10 P-51s, and Georg Peter Eder, who claimed 9 P-51s among his 12 jet victories, achieved individual successes, these heroic efforts had virtually no strategic impact. For every Mustang shot down, dozens more appeared. The sheer, overwhelming numbers, combined with the P-51's operational flexibility, rendered the Mi-262's technical advantages moot. It was a stark lesson. Raw technology, without the industrial and human infrastructure to support it, is merely an expensive curiosity. By autumn 1944, the P-51's strategic focus had broadened to inflict even more profound damage on Germany. Operating in formidable squadron-strength units, Mustangs shifted their attention to Germany's vital transportation network. They attacked locomotives, rail yards, bridges, and canal locks, the arteries and veins of the German economy. The nation, utterly dependent on its rail transport system for everything from moving troops and supplies to delivering coal to power plants and food to cities, began a systematic collapse. On September 11, 1944, 36 P-51s from the 357th Fighter Group achieved an almost unbelievable feat. They destroyed 81 locomotives in a single day. The 357th, known as the Yoxford Boys, would eventually claim the highest number of air victories, 595.5, of any P-51 group in the 8th Air Force, a testament to their skill and the effectiveness of their aircraft. Reichsminister Albert Speer, Hitler's brilliant armaments minister, a man who understood the industrial and logistical underpinnings of war better than almost anyone, recorded his despair in his diary. His words were a chilling confirmation of the P-51's devastating impact. The American fighters have achieved what the heavy bombers couldn't: complete transportation paralysis. Coal cannot reach power plants. Parts cannot reach factories. Food cannot reach cities. The Mustang, designed to protect bombers, had become a strategic weapon in its own right, delivering the coup de grace to Germany's war economy. Beyond the stark statistics and strategic objectives, the P-51's dominance inflicted a profound, irreparable psychological trauma on German pilots. These were men who had entered service as the elite warriors of the sky, confident in their technical superiority and tactical prowess. The Mustang systematically demolished their entire worldview, leaving them with a crushing sense of futility. The P-51 pilots, in stark contrast, radiated an almost swaggering confidence that utterly demoralized their German opponents. They flew aggressive aerobatics over German cities, performed victory rolls over airfields they had just strafed, and dominated every engagement with overwhelming numbers and, crucially, superior training. The psychological asymmetry was devastating. German pilots, faced with this overwhelming, omnipresent threat, developed a fatalistic gallows humor to cope with their impossible situation. A dark joke circulated through fighter units, a macabre reflection of their despair. What does a German fighter pilot need for an Iron Cross? The answer, delivered with a bitter laugh: a P-51 escort to the cemetery. This dark humor, however, masked a deep and pervasive demoralization, a crushing sense that their fate was sealed. April 7, 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender, bore witness to the Sonderkommando Elbe operation, one of the Luftwaffe's final, desperate, large-scale missions. Approximately 180 to 200 Bf-109s, piloted mostly by inexperienced volunteers, attempted a suicidal mission to ram American bombers in a last-ditch effort to halt the bombing campaign. The results were catastrophic, a tragic testament to the Luftwaffe's utter collapse. American fighters, predominantly Mustangs, claimed approximately 130 to 140 German aircraft destroyed, while losing minimal numbers themselves. It was an act of ultimate desperation, ending in mass slaughter. After April 1945, the Luftwaffe, as a fighting force, effectively ceased to exist. Though aircraft and pilots remained, the will to fight had evaporated. Unit commanders simply stopped ordering missions, knowing they were sending their young, untrained pilots to certain death. The once proud force that had swept across Europe, that had terrorized the continent from 1939 to 1941, was reduced to hiding its remaining aircraft in forests and under camouflage nets, awaiting the inevitable. The final statistics of the P-51's impact paint a stark, complete picture of its decisive role. Total P-51s produced: a staggering 15,086 aircraft. Enemy aircraft destroyed in aerial combat: 450 confirmed. Enemy aircraft destroyed on ground: 4,131 confirmed. P-51s lost to all causes: 2,000 1020. Kill ratio. Approximately 3.6 to 1 in aerial combat, a testament to its superiority. The human cost for Germany was immense. German pilot losses. Western Front. Over 8,000 killed or missing in 1944. Over 3,000 killed or missing from January to May 1945. The total fighter pilot force was decimated. The decline in Luftwaffe strength was precipitous. January 1944, approximately 1,600 operational fighters. June 1944, 1,180 operational fighters. January 1945, 1,000 operational fighters. April 1945, a mere 325 operational fighters remained. The disparity in training hours speaks volumes about the qualitative gap. American pilots, 1944-45, 400-plus hours before combat. German pilots, early 1944, 160 to 220 hours. German pilots, late 1944, 10 to 160 hours. German pilots, 1945, some as low as 80 hours, a truly suicidal level of inexperience. Military historians universally acknowledge the P-51's decisive role in achieving Allied air superiority. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, a comprehensive post-war analysis, concluded unequivocally: the P-51 fighter, more than any other single weapon, won air superiority over Europe. The P-51 made possible 3 critical achievements that fundamentally altered the course of the war. 1. The continuation of the daylight strategic bombing campaign. Without the P-51, the devastating losses of 1943 would have forced the U.S. to abandon daylight bombing, potentially prolonging the war significantly. 2. The achievement of air superiority before D-Day. The clearing of German skies before the Normandy landings was absolutely critical, preventing the Luftwaffe from interfering with the invasion force. 3. The systematic destruction of the German transportation and oil infrastructure. This crippled Germany's ability to wage war, starving its armies and industries of vital resources. North American aviation's production miracle deserves immense recognition. At its peak, the company produced one completed Mustang approximately every 90 minutes. The Inglewood, California, and Dallas, Texas plants together employed tens of thousands of workers, with women comprising an astonishing 40% of the workforce. This industrial achievement contrasted starkly with German manufacturing, which, despite its impressive engineering, simply could not match the scale or speed of American mass production. While exact German production figures remain disputed due to incomplete records, it's clear that American fighter production far exceeded German capacity. The United States produced more P-51s alone than Germany produced of all single-engine fighter types, combined in 1944-45. This was a war of numbers, and America had them. Equally decisive was the American pilot training system. By 1944, the United States Army Air Forces operated one of history's largest and most sophisticated educational programs. Each pilot progressed through a rigorous, multi-stage process. Primary training. Approximately 65 hours focused on basic flight skills. Basic training. 75 hours introducing more complex maneuvers and instruments. Advanced training. 100 hours specializing in fighter or bomber aircraft. Operational training. 160-plus hours, encompassing extensive gunnery practice, formation flying, and combat tactics, often in dedicated units known as Operational Training Units, OTUs. This systematic, comprehensive approach produced pilots who arrived at combat units with over 400 hours of flight time, proficient in their aircraft and well-versed in combat scenarios. German pilots, by contrast, increasingly arrived at frontline units barely able to handle their aircraft, let alone fight effectively against seasoned opponents. It wasn't just about the plane. It was about the pilot behind the stick. The P-51's influence extended far beyond World War II. It demonstrated a profound truth about modern warfare. Air superiority results from systemic advantages: robust training, efficient production, meticulous logistics, and seamless technology integration, not from individual pilot skill or a single aircraft's performance alone. Former Luftwaffe ace Adolf Galland, reflecting years later, offered a brutally honest assessment. The P-51 was not necessarily superior to German fighters in every aspect, but it was good enough in all aspects, produced in overwhelming numbers, flown by well-trained pilots, and supported by unlimited resources. This combination was unbeatable. Galland, a warrior, understood that the individual duel had given way to an industrial contest. At a 1975 NATO conference, General Günther Rauhl, the man whose world began to unravel over Brandenburg, reflected on the P-51's ultimate impact. His words carry the weight of hard-won experience. The Mustang didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe. It destroyed the very concept of air superiority as we understood it. We thought in terms of individual combat, pilot skill, tactical victories. The Americans thought in terms of systems, production, and strategic dominance. They were fighting a different war, and they won. The transformation was complete. The Luftwaffe that had swept across Europe from 1939 to 1941, that had come within sight of victory over Britain, that had dominated the Eastern Front, was systematically dismantled and destroyed by American industrial democracy given wings. The P-51 Mustang was the instrument of this destruction. But the true weapon, the ultimate force that crushed German air power, was the society that produced it. A society capable of designing an aircraft in 102 days, manufacturing over 15,000 of them, training thousands of pilots to professional standards, and projecting this power across oceans to achieve total air superiority. The German pilots, who so confidently dismissed American fighters in 1943, never expected the P-51 to crush the Luftwaffe because they never truly understood the nation behind it. They saw aircraft where they should have seen assembly lines. They counted pilots where they should have counted comprehensive training programs. They measured range where they should have measured boundless industrial capacity. By the time they understood the true nature of American power, it was too late. The hunters had become the hunted, and the European skies belonged unequivocally to the Mustangs. The Luftwaffe's destruction was not just a military defeat. It was a profound demonstration that free societies, fully mobilized and unified by a common cause, could generate power and resilience beyond the comprehension of totalitarian systems. In the end, the P-51 Mustang proved that victory in modern war came not from warrior spirit or racial superiority, but from the mundane, yet utterly decisive realities of industrial production, systematic training, and logistical excellence. The German pilots never expected to be crushed by the P-51 because they never expected to face the unlimited productive capacity of American democracy. When they finally understood, their understanding came from the wrong end of 6 A-50 caliber machine guns, high above the burning ruins of the Third Reich.